Sometimes the most wounded creatures find each other when they need it most. In New Mexico's desert, a broken man and dying mountain lion discover healing comes unexpectedly. Tom Reyes lost everything when cancer took his wife. Now he wanders his ranch like a ghost, avoiding neighbors and nursing wounds that won't heal. When a starving mountain lion collapses near his property, townspeople want her destroyed. But Tom sees something familiar in her eyes, the same hollow ache from his mirror. The cat refuses food, growing weaker daily. Then one quiet dawn, Tom reads his wife's favorite poem aloud. Lion's ears twitch. She lifts head. What happens next will change everything you know about the bond between man and beast. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the red mesa walls in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the high desert floor of northern New Mexico. Tom Reyes stood on his front porch, coffee mug warming his weathered hands, watching the light creep across land he'd called home for 37 years. The silence stretched endlessly in every direction. No cattle lowing in the distance, no sound of Maria's humming from the kitchen behind him. Just the whisper of wind through juniper and pinon pine. At 58, Tom carried himself with the deliberate movements of a man who'd spent decades working with his hands. His shoulders bore the permanent set of someone accustomed to lifting fence posts and wrestling stubborn cattle, though both tasks had grown scarce in recent years. Silver threaded through his dark hair, and deep lines mapped the corners of his eyes, marks left by squinting into desert sun, and more recently, by grief that seemed to settle deeper with each passing season. The ranch sprawled across 400 acres of high desert country, bordered by Bureau of Land Management wilderness on 3 sides. Tom and Maria had built everything here from nothing, starting with a double-wide trailer and a dream of raising cattle in some of the most beautiful, unforgiving country God ever made. Over the decades, they'd replaced the trailer with a modest adobe house, added barns and corrals, and watched their herd grow to nearly 200 head of sturdy Angus and Hereford crosses. Now, the corrals stood empty. The hay barn held only memories and mouse nests. Tom had sold the last of his cattle 18 months ago, unable to muster the energy or desire to continue the work that had once defined his life. Maria would have understood. She always did. But her absence made every decision feel both necessary and like a betrayal of everything they'd built together. He walked the familiar path to the barn, boots crunching on gravel they'd laid together one scorching summer in 1998. Maria had insisted on doing her share despite the heat, wearing one of his old hats and singing Mexican folk songs her grandmother had taught her. Tom could still hear her voice echoing off the barn walls, could still see her wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her work gloves, leaving a streak of dust that made him laugh. Inside the barn, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through gaps in the weathered boards. The familiar sense of hay and leather brought back a flood of memories. Calving seasons, when they'd check first-time mothers every few hours. Hot summer days spent moving cattle to fresh pasture. Quiet evenings, when Maria would bring him iced tea while he repaired tack by lamplight. Tom's morning routine had settled into a pattern of maintenance tasks that kept his hands busy while his mind wandered. Check the well pump. Inspect fence lines for damage from winter storms. Oil the hinges on gates that no longer swung open for livestock. Each chore served a practical purpose, but more importantly, they filled the hours between sunrise and sunset, giving structure to days that otherwise threatened to drift into meaningless silence. The ranch house itself reflected the gradual decline that had crept in since Maria's death. She'd been the one who noticed when paint began to peel, when the garden needed weeding, when curtains had faded beyond respectability. Without her careful attention to such details, the place had taken on a weathered, abandoned quality that matched Tom's own state of mind. Windows went unwashed. The small flower garden Maria had tended with such care grew wild and eventually surrendered to native grasses and weeds. Most painful was Maria's study, a small room off the living room, where she'd kept her books and correspondence. Tom hadn't touched anything in there since her funeral. Her leather-bound collection of poetry still sat on the reading table beside her favorite chair, bookmarked with a pressed wildflower at a page of Neruda verses she'd particularly loved. The room held her presence so strongly that Tom often found himself pausing outside the door, half expecting to hear her voice reading aloud as she'd done on countless evenings. Maria Elena Sandoval had been 23 when they married, fresh out of college with a degree in elementary education and a fierce determination to make her mark on the world. Tom was 25 then, working as a ranch hand for old Mr. Peterson and saving every penny toward buying his own land. They'd met at a church social in Las Cruces, where Maria was teaching second grade and Tom had driven down to visit his cousin. She'd been reading poetry to a group of children under a cottonwood tree, her voice giving life to words about butterflies and summer rain. "You know," she'd told him on their third date, "poetry isn't just pretty words. It's the truth of human experience distilled down to its essence." Tom had nodded, not really understanding but captivated by the passion in her dark eyes. Over the years, he'd come to appreciate her perspective as she read to him in the evenings, helping him see beauty and meaning in verses that might otherwise have seemed foreign to a practical man. They'd dreamed together of building something lasting on this harsh, beautiful land. Maria had wanted children, lots of them, and Tom had pictured the house filled with voices and laughter, the ranch passing down through generations. But children never came, and after years of hoping and heartbreak, they'd gradually accepted that their legacy would be the land itself and the life they'd built together. Tom's isolation had become almost complete in the 2 years since Maria's death. Neighbors still stopped by occasionally. Jake Morrison from the adjacent spread, Father Miguel from the parish church, Dr. Sarah Chen, who tended Maria through her final illness. But Tom found conversations increasingly difficult, as if grief had erected a barrier between himself and the rest of the world. People meant well, but their offers of casseroles and companionship only reminded him of everything he'd lost. The desert landscape around the ranch changed with the seasons, but slowly, in the measured time of high country. Spring brought brief explosions of wildflowers, desert lupine, Indian paintbrush, ghost flower that bloomed white as bone in the moonlight. Summer stretched hot and dry, broken occasionally by afternoon thunderstorms that drummed against the metal roof and filled the arroyos with rushing water. Fall painted the cottonwoods along the creek in shades of gold and amber. Winter brought snow that outlined every juniper branch and turned the red rock mesas into monuments of white and crimson. Maria had loved each season in its turn, finding beauty and meaning in the desert's stark grandeur. She taught Tom to see past the harshness to the subtle miracles, how desert willow bloomed after the first summer rain, how roadrunners raised their families in seemingly impossible places, how the silence itself was not empty, but full of life too quiet for hurried people to notice. Now Tom moved through the seasons like a man walking in his sleep. He maintained the basic infrastructure of the ranch, but the joy had drained out of the work. The corrals designed for cattle stood empty, except for occasional deer seeking shelter from storms. The pastures grew tall with native grasses that no livestock grazed. Even the small garden where Maria had grown tomatoes and chilies reverted to desert, as if the land itself mourned her absence. Evenings were the hardest time. Tom would sit on the front porch as darkness gathered, listening to coyotes singing in the distance and feeling the weight of solitude press down like the approaching night. Sometimes he'd go inside and stand at the threshold of Maria's study, his hand on the doorframe, remembering the sound of her voice reading poems that spoke of love and loss and the strange beauty of being human in an indifferent universe. The leather-bound book of poetry sat where she'd left it, a collection of works by Garcia Lorca, Neruda, and Mary Oliver that had been her constant companion. Tom had given it to her for their first anniversary, and she'd carried it with her through all the years of their marriage, finding in those pages words for feelings that everyday language couldn't express. Even now, he could picture her fingers tracing the lines of verse, her lips moving silently as she absorbed the rhythm and meaning of each carefully chosen word. But Tom couldn't bring himself to open the book. It felt too much like trespassing on sacred ground, like disturbing a shrine that preserved the essence of everything he'd lost. Instead, he'd retreat to his bedroom and lie awake listening to the house settle around him, aware of every empty room and every silence that should have been filled with Maria's presence. During the day, he forced himself through the motions of living, feed himself, though food had lost its taste, shower and shave, though no one would see him, check the weather report, though it rarely affected his plans, pay bills and answer correspondence, though most of it seemed to belong to another life entirely. Each task completed was a small victory against the lethargy that threatened to overwhelm him completely. The ranch had always demanded a partnership between Tom and Maria, her organizational skills complementing his physical labor, her attention to detail balancing his tendency to focus on the big picture. Without her, he felt like a man trying to dance alone, his movements awkward and incomplete. Bills went unpaid until the last minute. Repairs that she would have noticed and mentioned went undone until they became major problems. The rhythm of their shared life had been disrupted beyond repair. Some nights, Tom found himself talking to her photograph on the mantel, updating her on small events she would have cared about. The Hawk family nesting in the big cottonwood, the wildflower bloom along the creek, the way morning light hit the kitchen window just as it always had. These one-sided conversations provided a strange comfort, as if maintaining the habit of sharing his thoughts with her kept some essential part of their relationship alive. But mostly, Tom existed in a state of suspended animation, neither fully living nor allowing himself to simply give up. He was a man caught between worlds, too young to surrender entirely to grief, too damaged to imagine a future that didn't include the woman who'd been his partner in everything that mattered. The ranch continued around him, following the ancient rhythms of desert life, while Tom drifted through his days like a ghost haunting his own existence. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the air and promising another day of solitude stretching endlessly ahead. Tom finished his coffee and set the empty mug on the porch railing, preparing for another round of purposeless tasks designed to fill the hours until darkness offered temporary escape. He had no way of knowing that this particular morning would bring an encounter that would change everything, that somewhere in the desert around his property, another wounded creature was fighting her own battle with survival and loss. Tom first noticed something wrong at the old cattle tank near the east pasture fence line. From a distance, what looked like a pile of weathered wood or discarded tarp proved to be something else entirely as he approached. The shape resolved into the unmistakable form of a large cat, lying motionless beside the concrete watering structure he'd built with Maria 15 years earlier. His breath caught as recognition dawned. A mountain lion, a big female by the look of her, lay collapsed on her side in the dust. Tom had encountered lions before over the decades, usually glimpsed as tawny shadows disappearing into rocks and juniper, occasionally finding their tracks around the water sources that dotted his property. But this one wasn't moving with the fluid grace that made these cats seem more spirit than flesh. This one was dying. Tom approached slowly, every instinct warning him to maintain distance from an apex predator, even one in obvious distress. The lion's ribs showed clearly beneath her dull coat, and her breathing came in shallow, labored pants. Dark stains matted the fur along her left flank, where old wounds had festered and partially healed without proper care. Her eyes, pale green and startlingly intelligent, tracked his movement, but held no energy for defense or flight. Standing 10 feet away, Tom found himself looking into those eyes and seeing something that struck him like a physical blow. The expression there wasn't the wild alertness he'd expect from a cornered predator. Instead, he saw the same hollow exhaustion that greeted him every morning in his bathroom mirror. The look of a creature that had simply run out of reasons to keep fighting. The practical part of his mind, honed by decades of ranch work, immediately began calculating options. Call the Fish and Wildlife Office, and they'd send someone to euthanize her. Standard procedure for an injured mountain lion, this close to human habitation. Call the county sheriff and get much the same result, probably with less expertise and more bureaucracy. Leave her alone and she'd be dead by evening, if not sooner. The drought had been particularly harsh this summer, and competition for water and prey had pushed predators to desperate measures. But as Tom studied the lion's condition, memories surfaced of Maria nursing injured animals back to health over the years. She'd had a gift for it, an intuitive understanding of what hurt creatures needed. Broken-winged hawks, orphaned rabbits, even a coyote pup with the infected leg had found sanctuary under her care until they could survive on their own. She'd maintained a small but well-equipped veterinary kit for treating everything from livestock injuries to wild animal emergencies. Every living thing deserves a chance, she'd tell him when he protested the expense or the risk. Sometimes we're the only hope they have. Tom walked back to the house, his mind churning with possibilities and doubts. In the barn, dust motes danced through afternoon sunlight as he located Maria's old medical supplies in their familiar wooden box. The contents looked exactly as she'd left them. Bottles of antibiotics, rolls of gauze, syringes, wound cleaner, and the small caliber tranquilizer gun she'd occasionally used on particularly anxious patients. Her neat handwriting labeled everything, complete with dosage notes and expiration dates. Returning to the tank with the medical kit and a heavy tarp, Tom found the lion unchanged. If anything, her breathing seemed more labored. The smart thing would be to make that phone call and let trained professionals handle the situation. The legal thing would be to report the presence of an injured predator on his property. The safe thing would be to stay far away and let nature take its course. Instead, Tom found himself spreading the tarp beside the motionless cat. "Easy, girl," he murmured, using the same low, steady tone that had calmed countless spooked horses and nervous cattle over the years. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." The lion's eyes followed his movements, but she made no attempt to rise or retreat. Tom had handled enough sick animals to recognize the signs. This was a creature at the very edge of survival, conserving every ounce of remaining strength for the basic functions of breathing and circulation. Moving her would be risky, but leaving her exposed to the elements and scavengers would be a death sentence. Working slowly and speaking in the same calm voice, Tom managed to slide the tarp beneath the lion and drag her to the old horse barn that hadn't seen use since he'd sold his last mount 5 years earlier. The building was solid and secure, with a dirt floor covered in old straw and enough ventilation to stay comfortable in summer heat. More importantly, it was isolated enough that visitors wouldn't accidentally discover his unlikely patient. Tom fashioned a bed of clean straw in one of the larger stalls and carefully transferred the lion onto it. She weighed perhaps 90 pounds, substantial for a female, though far less than she should in healthy condition. Up close, the extent of her injuries became clearer. The wounds along her flank appeared to be from another lion's claws, probably inflicted during territorial disputes made more fierce by drought conditions. Infection had set in, and malnutrition had prevented proper healing. Following the procedures he'd watched Maria use dozens of times, Tom cleaned the wounds with antiseptic and applied antibiotic ointment. The lion tolerated his ministrations with surprising docility, perhaps too weak to resist, or perhaps recognizing his intent to help. Her pale green eyes never left his face, and Tom found himself talking to her as he worked. "Maria would know exactly what to do for you," he said, checking her dehydration by gently lifting the skin at her neck. She had magic hands when it came to hurt things. Never met a creature she couldn't coax back to health if they had any fight left in them. Tom set up water and food dishes within the lion's reach, though he held little hope she'd accept either. Wild animals often refused human offerings, even when desperately needed. The meat came from his own freezer, venison from a deer he'd taken the previous hunting season and never bothered to finish. The water was fresh from his well, cool and clean. As expected, the lion showed no interest in either offering. She lay with her head resting on crossed paws, breathing steadily, but making no move toward the sustenance that might save her life. Tom had seen this before in animals that had given up, a withdrawal from life that went beyond physical injury into something deeper and more troubling. Settling onto a hay bale across from the stall, Tom found himself studying the lion's face in the gathering twilight. Something about her expression reminded him powerfully of his own reflection during the darkest days after Maria's diagnosis. The same resignation, the same distance from hope, the same hollow acceptance of whatever ending waited ahead. "I know that look," he said quietly. "Believe me, I know exactly that look." The lion's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, a barely perceptible response that might have been involuntary. But something in that tiny movement encouraged Tom to continue talking. "Lost someone important, didn't you? Cubs maybe, or a mate. Something that made the whole world feel empty afterward." The words came easier than they had in months, perhaps because his audience couldn't judge or offer unwanted sympathy. "I lost my Maria 2 years ago come October. Cancer took her, slow and mean. Some days I think about just lying down and not getting up again, just like you're doing." The lion's eyes remained fixed on his face with an intensity that seemed almost human in its directness. Tom had the unsettling sense that she understood more than seemed possible. Not the words themselves, but the emotions behind them. Grief, it seemed, spoke a universal language that crossed species boundaries. As darkness settled over the ranch, Tom made his decision. Legal or not, smart or not, he would try to save this dying creature, partly because Maria would have expected nothing less, partly because he recognized something of himself in those pale green eyes, and partly because caring for another living thing might provide the purpose that had been missing from his life since the funeral. "All right, girl," he said, rising from the hay bale. "We're going to do this together, but you have to meet me halfway. You have to want to live." Walking back to the house under a canopy of desert stars, Tom felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of mission, of responsibility beyond his own survival. The lion might die despite his efforts, but at least she wouldn't die alone and uncared for, in a world that had taken away everything he'd loved. Offering compassion to another broken creature felt like the only meaningful choice left to make. The gold wedding band on Tom's left hand caught the early morning light as he prepared fresh water for the lion. He'd worn the ring for 30 years and had no intention of removing it, despite well-meaning suggestions from friends that it might be time to move on. The simple band was more than jewelry. It was a tangible connection to Maria, a reminder that some bonds transcend physical presence. This morning marked the 3rd day since he'd found the lion, and her condition remained troublingly unchanged. She accepted water when Tom brought it close to her muzzle, lapping weakly at the offered liquid, but the meat sat untouched in her dish until he removed it each evening. Research on his old desktop computer had provided sobering information about mountain lion behavior and dietary needs. A healthy adult female required 10 to 15 pounds of meat every few days, and this one hadn't eaten anything substantial in who knew how long. Tom had developed a careful routine around his patient's care. Early morning visits to check her condition and change her water, midday medication applications, spreading antibiotic ointment on her healing wounds, while speaking in the same low, steady voice. Evening checks to remove uneaten food and ensure she remained comfortable in her straw bed. Between these visits, he maintained his normal ranch activities, careful not to establish any patterns that might alert neighbors to unusual goings-on. The lion, he'd started thinking of her as Luna, though he couldn't say exactly why, seemed to recognize his footsteps approaching the barn. Her ears would prick forward at the sound, and those pale green eyes would track his movements with an alertness that hadn't been present the first day. Small signs, perhaps, but they encouraged Tom to believe that some spark of will to live remained beneath her weakened exterior. During the long hours between visits, Tom found himself thinking about Maria's final weeks more clearly than he had since her death. She'd faced her approaching end with a grace that amazed him, spending her remaining energy on things that brought beauty and meaning to each day. Poetry had been particularly important to her then. She'd asked him to read aloud when her own strength failed, finding comfort in the rhythm and imagery of carefully chosen words. Poetry speaks to the parts of us that ordinary language can't reach, she'd explained during one of their last conversations. It's like music for the soul, Tommy. When everything else fails, beautiful words can still touch whatever stays eternal inside us. On the fourth morning, Luna's breathing seemed more labored than usual. Tom sat on the hay bale across from her stall, watching the shallow rise and fall of her ribs and feeling helpless in the face of her decline. She'd drunk a little water but refused even the smallest piece of venison. If she didn't eat soon, she'd simply waste away regardless of his other care, almost without conscious decision. Tom began speaking to her about Maria, not the casual conversation he'd been maintaining, but deeper memories that he'd kept locked away since the funeral. She had this voice that could make any word sound like music, he told Luna. Even reading grocery lists, she'd find a rhythm that made them sound important. Used to drive me crazy sometimes, the way she'd turn everything into poetry. Luna's ears swiveled toward him at the change in his tone. Her eyes remained fixed on his face, with an intensity that seemed almost human in its focus. Encouraged by this response, Tom continued sharing memories he hadn't spoken aloud to anyone. The morning she died, she asked me to read her favorite poem one more time. Neruda, something about love that survives death and distance. My voice kept breaking on the words, but she smiled like I was singing her to sleep. Tom's own voice grew thick with emotion. I haven't been able to read poetry since. Feels too much like talking to ghosts. Something in Luna's expression seemed to soften as he spoke. Her breathing appeared to ease slightly, and for the first time since he'd found her, she shifted position without obvious discomfort. The movement was minimal, just a slight adjustment of her head on her paws, but it represented the most animation she'd shown in days. You know what? Tom said, struck by sudden inspiration. Maybe it's time I tried again. He walked to the house and returned with Maria's leather-bound poetry collection, the book falling open naturally to pages worn soft by repeated reading. The pressed wildflower bookmark marked one of the Neruda pieces Maria had particularly loved, verses about enduring affection that transcended physical separation. Tom settled back onto the hay bale and began reading aloud, his voice rusty from disuse but growing stronger with each line. Luna's response was subtle but unmistakable. Her ears remained pricked forward throughout the reading, and her breathing settled into a steadier rhythm. When Tom finished the poem and looked up, he found her watching him with an expression that seemed less distant than before. Well, I'll be damned, he murmured. Maria was right about poetry reaching places other words can't. The sound of a pickup truck approaching the house interrupted his reflections. Tom quickly closed the book and moved to the barn door, peering toward the driveway where Jake Morrison's familiar blue Ford was pulling to a stop. His neighbor's visits had become infrequent since Maria's death, but Jake occasionally stopped by to check on things or share local news. Tom walked out to meet him, pulling the barn door closed behind him and hoping Jake wouldn't notice the unusual precaution. His neighbor climbed out of the truck with the careful movements of a man in his 60s who'd spent too many years horseback and not enough time stretching. Morning, Tom. Thought I'd swing by and see how you're making out. Jake's weathered face carried the permanent squint of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading weather patterns and livestock behavior. Haven't seen much of you lately. Same as always, Tom replied, aware of how inadequate the response sounded. Keeping busy with maintenance stuff. Jake's eyes drifted toward the barn, and Tom fought the urge to step into his line of sight. Heard some interesting sounds coming from your direction the other night, Jake said casually. Almost sounded like Big Cat, but that would be unusual this close to buildings. Tom's heart rate quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. Coyotes, most likely. They've been more active lately with the drought pushing them closer to water sources. Maybe so. Jake didn't seem entirely convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Well, if you see any sign of lion activity, you'll want to call Fish and Wildlife. Had a rancher over near Espanola lose a calf to one last month. Folks are getting nervous about stock. They talked for a few more minutes about weather and local news before Jake climbed back into his truck. As the sound of the engine faded into the distance, Tom realized his hands were shaking slightly. The wedding ring felt warm against his finger, reminding him of Maria's presence during moments of stress. She'd always been the calm one during crises, helping him think through problems with her characteristic blend of practicality and compassion. Returning to Luna's stall, Tom found her in the same position, but somehow more alert. The brief interruption had reminded him of how precarious their situation was. Discovery would mean Luna's death and possibly legal troubles for himself. But looking into those pale green eyes, he knew he couldn't abandon her now, any more than he could remove the ring that connected him to Maria's memory. "We're in this together now," he told Luna softly. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The afternoon stretched ahead with its familiar mixture of routine tasks and careful vigilance. Tom found himself thinking less about the risks and more about the unexpected sense of purpose that caring for Luna had brought to his days. For the first time since Maria's death, he had a reason to get up each morning that went beyond mere survival. The carved walking stick leaning against the barn wall had taken Tom 3 months to complete during Maria's illness. Made from seasoned mesquite wood, its surface bore intricate patterns of desert wildflowers and hummingbirds that he'd etched with painstaking care during the long nights when sleep eluded him. Maria had used it during her final months, finding support for walks around the garden when her strength began to fail. Now it served as a reminder of his deep need to help those he loved, even when healing seemed impossible. On the 5th morning of Luna's care, Tom noticed something different in her demeanor. She lifted her head when he entered the barn, a movement that involved more energy than she'd shown since her arrival. Her eyes, still pale green and penetrating, tracked his movements with what appeared to be anticipation rather than mere awareness. "Good morning." "And girl," Tom said, settling onto his familiar hay bale with Maria's poetry book. "You seem a little stronger today." He'd taken to reading aloud each morning and evening, finding that Luna responded to the sound of his voice more than any other stimulus. Sometimes her ears would prick forward at particular passages, and occasionally she'd shift position during longer poems, as if getting comfortable for an extended listening session. This morning, Tom chose one of Maria's absolute favorites, Mary Oliver's Wild Geese, a piece about finding one's place in the world despite feelings of isolation and despair. As he began reading, Luna's response was more pronounced than he'd seen before. She lifted her head completely off her paws and turned to face him directly, her pale eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that was almost unsettling. "Tell me about despair." "Yours, and I will tell you mine," Tom read, his voice growing stronger with each line. "Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes." Luna made a sound. Not quite a purr, but a low rumble that seemed to resonate in her chest. Tom paused in his reading, amazed by this first vocal response since he'd found her. When he continued, her eyes never left his face, and that low sound continued intermittently throughout the rest of the poem. "Well now," Tom murmured, after finishing the final lines about wild geese calling across the sky. "That's the most response I've gotten from any audience in years." More remarkably, when Tom offered her water after the reading, Luna actually lifted her head to drink, rather than waiting for him to bring the dish to her muzzle. The change was subtle but significant, a sign that some spark of will to live was reasserting itself. Even more encouraging, when Tom placed a small piece of venison near her nose. She sniffed it with apparent interest for the first time since her arrival. Tom sat quietly, hardly daring to breathe as Luna examined the offered meat. After several minutes of consideration, she took a tentative bite, chewing slowly and carefully. It wasn't much, perhaps an ounce of the protein she desperately needed, but it represented the first food she'd accepted since collapsing by his water tank. "That's it, girl," Tom said softly. Small steps. Maria always said healing happens one small step at a time. The breakthrough filled Tom with an elation he hadn't experienced since before Maria's diagnosis. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely useful, as if his actions were making a measurable difference in another living being's survival. The feeling was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. It reminded him of how much capacity for caring still existed within him. Despite his efforts to numb himself against further loss, that afternoon brought an unexpected complication. Dr. Sarah Chen's white Honda pulled into his driveway, her monthly check-in that he'd somehow forgotten to anticipate. Sarah had been Maria's oncologist and had continued stopping by occasionally since the funeral, ostensibly to ensure Tom was managing his own health, but really to check on his emotional state. Her visits were well-intentioned, but always left him feeling exposed and defensive. Tom met her at the front door, hoping to conduct their conversation on the porch rather than inviting her inside, where she might notice his frequent glances toward the barn. Sarah was a small, efficient woman in her early 40s, with kind eyes and a direct manner that had made her effective at delivering difficult medical news. "You look better than the last time I saw you," she said, studying his face with professional assessment. "More color in your cheeks. Are you eating regularly?" The question caught Tom off guard because he realized it was true. His appetite had been slowly returning since Luna's arrival. Caring for another creature had reminded him of basic self-care habits he'd let slide during his deepest period of grief. "I've been keeping busy," he replied, which was accurate if incomplete. "Lot of maintenance work around the place." Sarah accepted coffee on the porch, and they talked about routine matters, his blood pressure medication, the upcoming anniversary of Maria's death, her suggestion that he consider grief counseling. Tom answered appropriately, while part of his mind stayed focused on Luna's condition and whether she might make sounds that could reach the house. "Maria would want you to keep living, not just surviving," Sarah said toward the end of her visit. "She worried about how you'd manage alone out here." After she left, Tom returned to the barn with a mixture of relief and renewed purpose. Luna was awake and alert, her head raised as if she'd been listening for his return. The remainder of yesterday's meat was gone from her dish. The first time she'd finished a complete offering, "We had a visitor," Tom told her, settling onto his hay bale. "Someone who knew Maria. She thinks I'm looking better, and maybe I am. Funny how taking care of you has reminded me to take care of myself." Luna's eyes followed his movements as he refreshed her water and checked her wounds. The infections were healing cleanly, and her ribs no longer showed quite as prominently beneath her tawny coat. Small improvements, but tangible evidence that his efforts were making a difference. As evening approached, Tom found himself sharing more personal details with Luna than he'd revealed to any human since Maria's death. He told her about the walking stick he'd carved, about sitting up nights during Maria's final months, feeling helpless despite his desperate desire to heal her. He described the peculiar grief that came with watching someone you love fade gradually, and the guilt that followed when part of you felt relieved that their suffering had ended. "I think that's what I recognize in your eyes," he said, as darkness gathered outside the barn. "That look that comes from losing something that made life make sense. But maybe we both still have some living left to do." Luna's response was another of those low, rumbling sounds that seemed to indicate understanding or at least comfort with his presence. Tom had begun sleeping better since her arrival, as if having a purpose beyond his own survival provided enough peace of mind to allow genuine rest. Walking back to the house under desert stars, Tom touched the carved walking stick one more time before switching off the barn light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and continued vigilance, but tonight he felt something approaching contentment. Luna was healing, and perhaps in some way he couldn't yet fully understand, so was he. The wedding ring on his finger caught starlight as he closed the barn door, and for the first time since Maria's death, its weight felt less like a burden and more like a blessing, a reminder that love, once given, continued to work in the world long after its original object was gone. The soft wool blanket had been Maria's constant companion during her final months. A gift from her sister in Albuquerque, woven in shades of desert sunset, coral, amber, and deep turquoise. Tom had found it folded carefully in the bedroom closet, still carrying the faint scent of Maria's lavender soap. Now it lay across Luna's straw bed, providing extra warmth during the cool desert nights that could drop 40 degrees from daytime temperatures. 2 weeks had passed since Luna's arrival, and her transformation was becoming undeniable. The hollow-eyed desperation had been replaced by alert awareness, and her coat was beginning to show the lustrous health that proper nutrition could restore. She now consumed her daily portions of venison completely, and her wounds had healed to pink scars that would eventually disappear beneath new fur growth. More significantly, Luna had begun allowing Tom to sit inside her stall during their evening poetry sessions. The first time he'd moved from the hay bale to the straw beside her bed, she'd tensed visibly but hadn't retreated. Now she seemed to expect his closer presence, sometimes shifting position to maintain visual contact as he read from Maria's collection of favorite verses. "You know, building this place was Maria's idea as much as mine," Tom said one evening, settling onto the straw with the poetry book and Maria's blanket wrapped around his shoulders. "She's the one who saw the potential in 400 acres of desert that most folks would call worthless." Luna lifted her head at the sound of his voice, those pale green eyes reflecting the battery-powered lantern that provided their evening illumination. Tom had established a routine of sharing memories alongside the poetry, finding that both activities seemed to calm and engage his unlikely audience. "We were living in that double-wide over there," he continued, gesturing toward where the trailer had once sat near the current house. Maria would spread architectural magazines across the kitchen table, showing me pictures of adobe houses and explaining how traditional building methods would work with the climate instead of fighting it. Tom remembered those early planning sessions with startling clarity, Maria's excitement as she sketched floor plans on napkins, her insistence that every room should have views of the mesas and desert beyond, her vision of a home that would grow organically from the landscape itself. She'd handled the permits and contractor negotiations, while Tom focused on the physical labor, their partnership flowing naturally from their complementary strengths. Luna made one of her low, rumbling sounds, the vocalization that Tom had come to interpret as contentment or agreement. She'd begun producing a variety of sounds during their conversations, soft chuffs when he arrived, rumbling purrs during poetry readings, and an almost conversational chirping when he shared particularly animated stories about ranch life. "The first winter here was brutal," Tom continued, opening the poetry book to a Robert Frost piece about resilience through difficult seasons. "Pipes froze, roof leaked, and we burned through our entire firewood supply by February. But Maria never complained. She'd wrap up in this same blanket and read poetry by the fireplace, while I tried to fix whatever had broken that day." As Tom read about woods filling with snow and promises to keep, Luna moved closer on her bed until her shoulder was nearly touching his leg. The gesture was subtle but significant, a wild predator choosing proximity to a human, demonstrating trust that had developed gradually through consistent care and gentle presence. The poetry reading had become the highlight of Tom's days. Luna responded to different poets with varying degrees of interest. Mary Oliver's nature imagery seemed to particularly capture her attention, while the love sonnets of Neruda inspired those low, rumbling vocalizations that Tom had begun thinking of as her form of applause. Frost's pieces about rural life and seasonal changes often prompted her to shift position, as if getting comfortable for longer recitations. During the day, when Tom worked on ranch maintenance, he found himself looking forward to evening barn visits with an anticipation he hadn't felt since Maria's final months. The prospect of sharing another poem, another memory, another quiet conversation with a creature who listened without judgment or advice gave structure and meaning to hours that had previously dragged past in empty routine. Luna's improved condition had brought new challenges alongside the obvious benefits. Her growing strength meant increased activity, and Tom occasionally found evidence of restless pacing in her stall. She'd begun showing interest in the barn's upper levels, sometimes staring fixedly at the hayloft as if calculating whether the wooden beams could support her weight. These behaviors reminded Tom that he was caring for a wild predator whose natural instincts would eventually reassert themselves. More troubling were the rumors beginning to circulate in town. Jake Morrison had mentioned hearing unusual sounds again, and the postal carrier had commented on Tom's increased trips to the feed store. Small observations that individually meant nothing, but collectively suggested unusual activity at a ranch that had been dormant for 2 years. "Folks are wondering what you're up to out there," Jake had said during his most recent visit. "Some think you might be getting back into the cattle business." Tom had deflected with vague comments about considering future livestock operations, but he knew such explanations would only work for so long. Luna's presence was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal as her strength returned and her natural behaviors emerged. One evening, as Tom read from a particularly melodic Garcia Lorca piece about Andalusian landscapes, Luna surprised him by extending one massive paw to rest against his leg. The gesture was gentle but deliberate, her claws carefully sheathed, her touch light as a cat's caress. Tom continued reading, while hardly daring to breathe, amazed by this voluntary physical contact from an apex predator who'd been dying just weeks earlier. "You trust me now, don't you, girl?" he murmured after finishing the poem. "Funny thing is, I'm starting to trust myself again, too." The realization struck him with unexpected force. For the first time since Maria's death, he felt genuinely useful, genuinely needed by another living creature. Luna's recovery had given him purpose beyond mere survival, and her trust had restored his confidence in his ability to care for something beyond himself. As autumn approached, Luna had begun displaying behaviors that Tom recognized as playful rather than aggressive. She'd bat at hanging bridle straps with quick paw movements, stalk shadows cast by the lantern light, and occasionally perform the stretching routine that cats use to maintain flexibility. These moments of levity reminded Tom that beneath the predator's dignified exterior lay a creature capable of joy and spontaneous movement. "Maria would have loved watching you recover," Tom told Luna as she demonstrated her hunting crouch for an imaginary prey animal. "She always said healing was as much about reclaiming joy as it was about mending what was broken." Walking back to the house each night, Tom found himself humming songs that Maria used to sing while cooking dinner. His own appetite had returned fully, and he'd begun taking more care with his appearance, shaving regularly and wearing clean clothes even when no visitors were expected. Small changes, but indicators of a man who was beginning to care about his own well-being again. The wool blanket stayed with Luna each night, carrying Maria's essence into the barn, where it provided comfort to another of God's creatures in need of healing. In that transfer of care and love, Tom glimpsed something that might have been his wife's continuing presence in the world, not as a ghost or memory, but as an ongoing capacity for compassion that could work through anyone willing to open their heart to another's suffering. The faded wedding photograph sat propped against the barn's weathered windowsill, showing Tom and Maria on their wedding day 30 years earlier, standing before the half-built adobe house with the mesa rising dramatically behind them. Maria's white dress caught the desert wind, and both their faces radiated the confidence of people building something lasting together. Tom had brought the picture to the barn after Luna began showing interest in the world beyond her stall, somehow needing tangible proof that love could flourish in harsh places. "See that young fool grinning like he'd conquered the world?" Tom asked Luna, gesturing toward his younger self in the photograph. "That was back when I thought I had all the answers. Before I learned that life has a way of teaching humility, whether you want the lesson or not." Luna had been with him for 3 weeks now, and her recovery continued to amaze him. She could stand and walk normally, her coat had regained its golden luster, and her eyes held the alert intelligence that marked a healthy predator. More concerning was her growing restlessness, the way she tested the stall door with her shoulders, studied the barn's upper reaches, and paced the confines of her temporary home with increasing frequency. Tom knew these signs meant Luna was approaching the point where captivity would become cruel rather than healing. Wild animals needed wild spaces, and keeping her confined much longer would damage the very spirit he'd worked so hard to restore. The knowledge created a painful internal conflict between his growing attachment and his understanding of what was best for her. This place was alive back then, Tom continued, settling onto the straw beside Luna's bed. Had 200 head of cattle scattered across these pastures, horses in the corrals, and enough work to keep 6 ranch hands busy year-round. Maria managed the books and the household, but she also had strong opinions about livestock breeding and pasture rotation. Luna's ears pricked forward at the change in his tone. She'd learned to recognize when Tom was beginning one of his longer stories, and she would position herself to maintain eye contact throughout his recitations. Sometimes she responded with soft vocalizations that seemed perfectly timed to his pauses, creating the illusion of actual conversation. Tom remembered those prosperous years with bittersweet clarity. The ranch had supported not just him and Maria, but a small community of workers and their families. Seasonal hands arrived for calving and roundup, and the bunkhouse stayed occupied most of the year. Maria would organize barbecues and holiday celebrations that brought together Anglo and Hispanic families in the kind of easy integration that marked successful ranch communities. Maria loved those gatherings, Tom said, his voice growing softer with memory. She'd start planning the Christmas party in September, making lists of who was expecting babies, who needed extra help that year, how to make sure everyone felt included. Said a ranch was only as strong as the people willing to work it. The economic downturn that ended those days had come gradually, then suddenly. Beef prices dropped while feed costs rose. Environmental regulations made water access more complex, and younger workers left for jobs that didn't require living in remote locations. Tom and Maria had managed the transition as long as possible, but eventually they'd been forced to sell the cattle and let the workers go. Last roundup was 15 years ago, Tom told Luna, remembering the bittersweet ceremony they'd made of loading the final cattle onto transport trucks. Maria insisted on cooking for all the hands one last time, even though we were letting them go. Said good work deserved proper recognition, no matter what economics forced us to do. Luna made one of her low, rumbling sounds and moved closer until her massive head rested against his thigh. The gesture had become natural over the past week, this physical closeness that would have been unthinkable during her first days of recovery. Tom stroked her fur carefully, marveling at the texture and warmth of an apex predator choosing to trust human touch. A sound outside the barn interrupted his reverie, Dr. Sarah Chen's distinctive Honda engine approaching the house. Tom tensed, realizing he'd lost track of time and forgotten about her weekly visit. Luna sensed his change in mood immediately, her head rising alertly as she scanned for potential threats. "Stay quiet, girl," Tom whispered, rising quickly and moving toward the barn door. "Company's coming, and they can't know about you." Tom met Sarah in the driveway, hoping his forced casualness would mask his anxiety about her unexpected timing. She carried a small medical bag and wore the expression of someone conducting official business, rather than a friendly social call. "I've been hearing interesting reports about activities on your property," she said without preamble. "Unusual sounds, changes in your routine, frequent trips to town. People are concerned about your welfare." Tom felt his heart rate accelerate, but kept his expression neutral, just maintaining the place and considering some future plans. "Nothing that should concern anyone." Sarah studied his face with the same professional assessment she'd used during Maria's treatment. "You do look healthier than you have since the funeral. Better color, more energy, like you're sleeping properly again. What's changed?" The question caught Tom off guard because it was accurate in ways he couldn't explain without revealing Luna's presence. Caring for the mountain lion had restored his sense of purpose and renewed his interest in basic self-care. He was eating regularly, sleeping through the night, and taking pride in his appearance for the first time in 2 years. "Maybe I'm finally finding my footing again," he said, which was true, if incomplete. After Sarah left with promises to check in again soon, Tom returned to the barn to find Luna pacing restlessly in her stall. Her behavior had changed during his absence, showing signs of anxiety that reminded him uncomfortably of caged zoo animals. The sight filled him with guilt and recognition that their arrangement was becoming untenable. "I know this isn't fair to you," Tom said, opening the stall door to sit with her. "You need space to run, territory to claim, the chance to live as nature intended." That evening's poetry session was interrupted by Luna's sudden focus on something outside the barn. Her entire body went rigid, ears pricked forward, eyes fixed on invisible movement beyond the walls. Tom followed her gaze, but saw nothing in the gathering darkness. Then Luna moved with fluid grace toward the door, her body demonstrating the hunting crouch of a predator spotting prey. "What is it, girl?" Tom whispered, moving to peer through the crack in the door. A family of javelinas was rooting through the grass near the old water tank, their pig-like forms clearly visible in the moonlight. Luna's response was immediate and instinctive, every muscle tensed for a strike that couldn't come from within the confines of the barn. Watching her natural predatory behavior reassert itself, Tom felt his first genuine laughter in over 2 years. "You're ready, aren't you?" he said, marveling at her perfect stillness and focused attention. "Every instinct telling you to hunt, to claim territory, to be what you were born to be." Luna remained frozen in hunting position for several minutes, even after the javelinas moved away into the darkness. When she finally relaxed and returned to her bed, Tom saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not just health and strength, but a wildness that no amount of human care could satisfy. Looking at the wedding photograph in the lantern light, Tom understood that love sometimes meant letting go, even when holding on felt easier. Maria's face smiled back at him from 3 decades past, reminding him that the best relationships were built on trust, not possession. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but tonight he sat with a healed mountain lion and acknowledged the truth they both already knew. Luna was ready to return to the wild, and despite his heart's protests, Tom was going to help her make that journey. Tom first noticed the collar while brushing Luna's neck during their evening routine. What he'd initially taken for a natural fold in her fur proved to be worn leather, faded to the color of desert dust and nearly hidden beneath her thick coat. His fingers traced the edge carefully, feeling buckles and metal that didn't belong on a wild mountain lion. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom murmured, working his fingers beneath the collar to examine it more closely. "You've got secrets, don't you, girl?" Luna remained calm during his exploration, even tilting her head to give him better access to the hidden band. The leather was high quality, but weathered by exposure to the elements, and Tom could feel the raised outline of tags or identification plates attached to the buckle area. Getting a clear look required careful maneuvering in the lamplight. The tags told a story Tom hadn't expected. One bore a rabies vaccination record from a veterinary clinic in Santa Fe, dated 18 months earlier. The other contained contact information for Vasquez Wildlife Sanctuary and a phone number with a local area code. Most surprising was a third tag with the simple inscription Luna engraved in flowing script. "So that's your real name," Tom said, sitting back on his heels to study the evidence. "All this time I've been calling you what you actually are." The implications hit him gradually. Luna wasn't a wild mountain lion who'd simply fallen on hard times. She was an escaped animal from a legitimate wildlife facility, probably raised in captivity and accustomed to human contact. That explained her relatively calm acceptance of his care and her apparent enjoyment of their poetry sessions. It also meant someone was almost certainly looking for her. Tom's research the next morning revealed that Vasquez Wildlife Sanctuary specialized in caring for big cats that couldn't survive in the wild due to injury, human imprinting, or other circumstances that made release impossible. Their website showed professional facilities and described a mission: focused on providing permanent homes for animals that fell between the cracks of wildlife management systems. The phone call required more courage than Tom had needed for anything since Maria's funeral. Elena Vasquez answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the controlled urgency of someone who'd been waiting for important news for far too long. "This is about Luna, isn't it?" she said after Tom identified himself and explained about finding an injured mountain lion with sanctuary tags. "Please tell me she's alive." "She's alive," Tom said, and heard Elena's sharp intake of breath. "Hurt when I found her, but recovering well. She's been with me for almost a month now." The silence stretched long enough that Tom wondered if the connection had failed. When Elena spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "I've been searching for her since May. She escaped during a thunderstorm when a tree fell on her enclosure. We've had teams out every week, followed up on every possible sighting, but it's like she vanished into the desert." Eleanor's story unfolded over the next hour. Luna had arrived at the sanctuary as a 6-month-old cub after her mother was shot by ranchers. And raised by sanctuary staff, she'd never learned proper wild behaviors and couldn't be released. She'd lived contentedly at the facility for 8 years until a series of tragedies changed everything. 2 years ago, we tried breeding her with our male, Miguel, Elena explained. Luna had 2 cubs, beautiful, healthy babies. But Miguel had never learned proper parenting behaviors either, and during a dominance dispute, he killed both cubs while Luna watched. Tom felt something cold settle in his stomach as Elena continued. Luna changed completely after that. Stopped eating regularly, became withdrawn, showed no interest in activities she'd previously enjoyed. It was like watching someone die of grief. Then the storm gave her the chance to escape, and she took it. The parallel between Luna's loss and his own struck Tom with devastating clarity. Both of them had watched helplessly as death claimed what they loved most. Both had withdrawn from life afterward, choosing isolation over the risk of future pain. Luna's refusal to eat when he'd first found her wasn't just physical weakness. It was the same surrender to despair that had characterized his own past 2 years. "She needs to come home," Eleanor said. "The sanctuary is her only chance for a safe life. Wild-born lions won't accept her, and she doesn't have the skills to survive alone long-term." Tom found himself arguing for more time, claiming Luna needed additional recovery before transport. Elena agreed to visit the following day, and Tom spent the intervening hours wrestling with emotions he couldn't fully name. Luna had become more than a patient. She was the first living creature since Maria to provide him with genuine purpose and affection. That evening, as he prepared for what might be their final poetry session, Tom made a discovery that changed everything. While searching Maria's study for information about wildlife rehabilitation, he found a manila envelope tucked behind her favorite poetry collection, sealed and marked, "For Tommy, when you're ready to live again." Inside were 7 letters in Maria's careful handwriting, each dated during her final weeks and labeled with different occasions: when you feel lost, when you're angry at God, when you think about giving up, and others. Tom's hands shook as he opened the first letter. Marked simply, "When you find something worth saving." "My dearest Tommy," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means you've found your way back to caring about something other than your own pain. I knew this day would come, even when you couldn't imagine it yourself." Maria's words reached across the months since her death with startling clarity. She'd known him well enough to predict his period of withdrawal and isolation, but she'd also known him well enough to trust that his essential nature, his need to heal and protect, would eventually reassert itself. "You have always been a man who saves broken things," the letter continued. "Remember the hawk with the damaged wing, the coyote pup with the infected leg, the countless cattle you nursed through difficult births. Caring for wounded creatures is how you express love. Tommy, it's who you are at your core." The letter went on to describe her hopes for his future, not that he would forget her or stop missing her, but that he would find new ways to channel his capacity for love and protection. She'd included specific instructions about her belongings, including the poetry collection she wanted him to keep reading aloud. Poetry was never about the words themselves, she'd written. It was about the space between us when I read to you, the connection that formed when we shared something beautiful together. Find someone else who needs to hear beautiful words. Tommy, find someone else who needs the kind of care only you can give. When Elena Vasquez arrived the next morning, Tom was prepared for a conversation he dreaded, but now understood was necessary. Elena was a compact woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the confident movements of someone accustomed to working with dangerous animals. Her relief at seeing Luna healthy and alert was immediate and genuine. "She looks wonderful," Elena said, tears brightening her eyes as Luna approached the stall door with casual familiarity. "You've done incredible work with her." Tom explained his discovery of Luna's collar and his research into her background. Elena confirmed the details and added others: Luna's specific dietary needs, her favorite activities, her particular response to human voices and music. Most importantly, she shared her assessment of Luna's psychological state. "She's never recovered from losing her cubs," Elena said, watching Luna's response to Tom's voice. "But she seems more engaged with you than she's been with anyone since the tragedy. You've given her back something I thought was gone forever." The decision they faced together was complex. Luna couldn't survive long-term in the wild, but keeping her confined indefinitely seemed cruel to an animal that had rediscovered her zest for life. Elena proposed a solution that honored both Luna's needs and Tom's obvious attachment. "The sanctuary can provide her with proper space and professional care," Elena said. "But we could also use someone with your obvious skills as a volunteer. You could continue working with her while she transitions back to sanctuary life." Looking into Luna's pale green eyes, Tom saw acceptance rather than distress about the approaching change. Perhaps she understood, in whatever way wild creatures comprehend such things, that their time together had served its purpose for both of them. She'd helped him rediscover his capacity for care and connection. He'd helped her remember that life could still hold meaning despite devastating loss. "Maria would want me to do what's best for Luna," Tom said finally, touching the mountain lion's massive head through the stall bars. "And what's best is getting her back to where she belongs, with people who can give her the life she deserves." Elena smiled, understanding more than Tom had said aloud. "Love isn't about keeping something for yourself. It's about helping it flourish wherever that's possible." As they made arrangements for Luna's transport to the sanctuary, Tom felt grief and relief in equal measure. He was losing another source of love and purpose, but this time he was choosing to let go rather than having loss forced upon him. The difference felt significant in ways he was only beginning to understand. The ranch deed and property papers lay spread across the kitchen table, yellow documents that told the story of 37 years of dreams, struggle, and shared purpose. Tom had pulled them from the filing cabinet while Elena made phone calls to arrange Luna's transport, needing to touch something tangible that represented the life he and Maria had built together. The papers bore both their signatures, their joint commitment to making something lasting from desert land that others had dismissed as worthless. Elena returned from the front porch where she'd been coordinating with her staff, her expression mixing relief with professional concern. "The transport team can be here tomorrow afternoon," she said, settling into the chair across from Tom. "Luna's enclosure at the sanctuary has been ready for months. We never gave up hope of finding her." Tom studied the deed's faded ink while processing the timeline. 24 hours to prepare Luna for another major transition, to say goodbye to a creature who'd become central to his daily existence, to return to the solitude that had defined his life before her arrival. The prospect felt both necessary and devastating. "There's something else I need to tell you," Elena continued, her voice gentle but direct. "Luna's escape wasn't just about the storm damage. She'd been showing increasing signs of depression and withdrawal before that night. We think she was looking for something, maybe trying to find her cubs, maybe just trying to escape the memories that kept her trapped. The observation struck Tom as painfully familiar. How many times over the past 2 years had he considered leaving the ranch entirely, abandoning the places and possessions that reminded him constantly of Maria's absence? Only inertia and lack of imagination about alternatives had kept him anchored to this land that held equal measures of joy and sorrow. She found what she was looking for here, Tom said, watching through the window as Luna paced restlessly in her stall. Or maybe I found what I was looking for through helping her. Elena's expression showed understanding born of long experience with both animals and humans in crisis. Healing rarely happens in isolation, she said. Luna needed someone who understood loss deeply enough to recognize it in another creature. You provided that recognition and the patience to let recovery happen naturally. That evening, Tom spent extra time reading Maria's remaining letters, searching for guidance about letting go of something precious before loss was forced upon him. Her words revealed remarkable insight into his character and the challenges she knew he'd face after her death. You will want to hold on to everything that reminds you of our life together. She'd written in the letter marked, "When you need to make hard choices, but holding on too tightly can poison the very memories you're trying to preserve. True love means wanting the best for someone or something, even when that means accepting separation." Maria had understood his tendency toward fierce protectiveness, his desire to shield loved ones from any possible harm. She'd also understood that such impulses, taken to extremes, could become prisons for both protector and protected. Luna needed space to live as fully as her circumstances allowed, not the security of a barn that was slowly becoming too small for her recovering spirit. Tom's internal struggle intensified when Jake Morrison arrived unexpectedly that evening, his truck pulling into the driveway just as Tom was preparing for his final poetry session with Luna. Jake's timing couldn't have been worse. Elena's rental car was still parked by the house, and any sound from the barn would now be impossible to explain away. "Evening, Tom," Jake said, climbing out of his truck with the deliberate movements of someone nursing a bad back. "Saw the extra vehicle and thought I'd check that everything's all right." Tom met him halfway to the house, hoping to keep the conversation away from the barn, where Luna's occasional vocalizations might be audible. "Everything's fine. Just have a visitor helping me with some decisions about the ranch's future." Jake's weathered face showed polite interest, mixed with the curiosity of someone who'd known Tom for 2 decades. "Glad to hear you're thinking about future plans. This place has too much potential to stay empty much longer." The conversation that followed was carefully diplomatic, Jake expressing concern about Tom's isolation, Tom deflecting questions about his specific plans, both men dancing around topics that couldn't be discussed directly. But as they talked, Tom became aware of sounds from the barn that Jake couldn't help but notice. "That's an interesting sound," Jake said, his head turning toward the source of Luna's evening vocalizations. "Almost sounds like coyotes," Tom said quickly. "They've been denning somewhere nearby and getting more vocal as the weather cools." Jake's expression suggested skepticism, but he didn't press the issue. After promising to stop by again soon, he climbed back into his truck and drove away into the gathering darkness. Tom watched his taillights disappear before allowing himself to acknowledge how close they'd come to discovery. Elena had observed the entire exchange from the kitchen window, and when Tom returned to the house, her expression was serious. "How long do you think you can keep this secret?" she asked. "Word is already spreading that something unusual is happening here. It's only a matter of time before someone calls Fish and Wildlife or the Sheriff's Department." The question forced Tom to confront the reality he'd been avoiding. Luna's presence was becoming impossible to conceal, and discovery by authorities would mean bureaucratic complications that could endanger her well-being. The sanctuary offered legal protection and proper facilities that he couldn't provide long-term. "You're right," Tom admitted. "I've been selfish, wanting to hold on to her because she's brought purpose back to my life. But that's about my needs, not hers. That night's poetry session carried special weight as Tom prepared to say goodbye. He'd chosen passages from Mary Oliver about the cycles of love and loss that defined natural life, verses that acknowledged both the pain of separation and the continuing beauty that made such pain worthwhile. Luna seemed to sense the approaching change in their routine. She remained unusually attentive throughout the reading, her pale green eyes never leaving Tom's face, her occasional vocalizations softer and more frequent than usual. When he finished reading, she moved closer and rested her massive head against his shoulder in a gesture that felt like both gratitude and farewell. "You saved my life too. You know," Tom told her, stroking the fur behind her ears. "I was dying just as surely as you were, just in a different way. Maria knew I'd need something to take care of, something that would remind me how to love without fearing loss." The ranch deed remained spread on the kitchen table when Tom returned to the house, a reminder of the choice between past and future that Luna's departure represented. He could continue living as a caretaker of memories, maintaining the physical structures of the life he'd shared with Maria while avoiding the risks of new connections. Or he could honor her memory by embracing the capacity for love and service that she'd recognized as central to his character. Elena's offer to volunteer at the sanctuary provided a bridge between these alternatives, a way to continue caring for Luna while developing new relationships and purposes. The prospect was both exciting and terrifying, requiring him to leave the emotional safety of isolation for the messier reality of ongoing connection with the world. "Change is always hard," Maria had written in her final letter, the one marked "when you're ready to live fully again. But staying in place when life is calling you forward isn't really living. It's just existing in a prettier version of death." Morning brought the sanctuary transport team, 3 professionals with a specialized trailer and years of experience moving large predators safely. Tom watched their preparations with a mixture of admiration for their expertise and growing anxiety about Luna's departure. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned, but that didn't make the approaching separation any easier to bear. Luna herself seemed remarkably calm about the activity surrounding her stall. She observed the new people with alert curiosity rather than fear, perhaps recognizing the familiar scents and sounds of her original home. When Eleanor entered the stall to fit a transport harness, Luna submitted to the process with the cooperation of an animal that understood the routine. She remembers, Eleanor said, adjusting the harness straps with practiced efficiency. This is going home for her, not another displacement. Tom's role in the transport was minimal, but emotionally overwhelming. Luna walked calmly into the specialized trailer, pausing only to look back at him with an expression that seemed to acknowledge their shared journey. Then she settled onto the padded floor and waited patiently for departure, every line of her body suggesting readiness for whatever came next. Standing beside the loaded trailer, Tom felt the same mixture of grief and rightness that had accompanied Maria's final breath. This separation was chosen rather than imposed, motivated by love rather than loss, but it still required all his strength to step back and let the process continue. "You'll come see her next week?" Elena asked, her hand resting gently on Tom's arm. "Yes," Tom said, watching Luna through the trailer's ventilation slats. "I need to know she's settling in well." As the convoy pulled away from the ranch, Tom remained standing in the driveway until the dust settled and silence returned to the desert morning. For the first time in a month, he was truly alone again. But the solitude felt different now, less like exile and more like the quiet space between one chapter ending and another beginning. The convoy never left the ranch. Just as Elena's transport team finished loading Luna into the specialized trailer, 3 official vehicles roared up the gravel drive in a cloud of dust and urgency. Sheriff Martinez led the procession in his white and green county cruiser, followed by 2 fish and wildlife officers in their government pickup trucks. Tom's father's old hunting rifle stood propped against the barn wall where it had remained untouched for decades, a relic of the time when encountering a mountain lion meant only one possible outcome. Thomas Reyes, Sheriff Martinez, called out, stepping from his vehicle with the formal bearing that meant serious business. We've received multiple reports of dangerous wildlife activity on your property. I need you to step away from that trailer immediately. Tom positioned himself between the officials and the transport vehicle, his heart hammering, but his voice steady. There's no danger here, Carlos. The situation is under control. Under control. Fish and Wildlife Officer Bradley spoke with the clipped authority of someone accustomed to unquestioned compliance. Sir, harboring a mountain lion without proper permits is a federal offense. That animal needs to be destroyed immediately as a public safety threat. Elena emerged from beside the trailer, her credentials in hand and her expression professionally calm despite the obvious tension. Officers, I'm Elena Vasquez from the Licensed Wildlife Sanctuary. This animal is returning to our facility under full legal authority. No destruction is necessary. Sheriff Martinez studied the scene with the careful assessment of someone who'd known Tom for 20 years and recognized this situation was more complex than initial reports had suggested. Tom, you want to explain what's been going on here? We've had neighbors reporting unusual sounds for weeks. The confrontation Tom had dreaded was finally here, but facing it directly felt less terrifying than he'd expected. Luna's recovery had given him something worth defending, and Maria's letters had reminded him that love required courage in the face of opposition. I found her dying by my water tank 6 weeks ago, Tom said, his voice carrying across the gathered officials and the small crowd of neighbors who'd followed the convoy. She was starving, infected, giving up. Same way I've been living since Maria died. Jake Morrison stood among the onlookers, his weathered face showing understanding rather than accusation. Dr. Sarah Chen had arrived in her Honda, apparently summoned by someone who'd noticed the official activity. Even Father Miguel from the parish church had come, drawn by concern for Tom's welfare. The law is clear about dangerous predators, Officer Bradley insisted, his hand resting on the tranquilizer gun at his belt. Public safety takes precedence over individual animal welfare. From inside the trailer came a sound that stopped all conversation, Luna's distinctive vocalization, the low, rumbling call she made when seeking Tom's attention. The sound was clearly directed toward him, recognizable even to people who'd never heard it before as communication rather than threat. Listen to that, Tom said, stepping closer to the trailer's ventilation slats. She's not dangerous. She's asking for reassurance because she can sense the hostility around her. Tom began speaking to Luna in the calm, steady voice he'd used throughout her recovery, and her response was immediate. The agitated pacing sounds from inside the trailer settled into quiet attention. When Tom moved along the side of the vehicle, Luna followed his movement from within, her soft chuffs audible to everyone present. I've never seen anything like that, Dr. Chen said quietly. She's responding to him like a domestic animal. Elena seized the opportunity to explain Luna's background, her sanctuary origins, her escape during the storm, her inability to survive in the wild due to human imprinting. This isn't a wild predator, she told the officials. This is a grieving mother who lost her cubs and ran away from home. Mr. Reyes has spent 6 weeks nursing her back to physical and emotional health. Sheriff Martinez lowered his weapon, his expression shifting from official suspicion to human curiosity. You've been caring for a mountain lion in secret for 6 weeks. I've been caring for a broken creature who needed someone to understand her pain, Tom corrected. Same way Maria used to care for injured animals. Same way this community cared for us during her illness. The crowd's mood was shifting as people began to understand the situation's true nature. Jake Morrison stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose opinion carried weight in the community. I've known Tom Reyes for 20 years, Jake said. If he says that animal isn't dangerous, then she isn't dangerous. Man's got better judgment about livestock and wildlife than anyone in this county, Father Miguel added his voice to the growing support. Sometimes healing requires us to extend care beyond what's conventional or convenient. This man has been practicing the kind of compassion the church tries to teach. Officer Bradley remained unmoved by the testimonials. Regulations exist for good reasons. That animal represents a clear threat to public safety, regardless of current behavior. The only threat here is to an animal that's already suffered enough, Tom said, his voice carrying the steel that surprised even him. Luna's going back to the sanctuary where she belongs. She's earned the right to live out her life in peace. As if summoned by her name, Luna appeared at the trailer's side window, her pale green eyes visible to everyone present. There was no aggression in her posture, no sign of the wild unpredictability that characterized truly dangerous animals. Instead, she displayed the calm alertness of a creature secure in her surroundings and confident in her caretaker's protection. "Look at her," Elena said, moving closer to the window. "Does that look like a mindless predator to you?" She's assessing the situation and choosing not to react with fear or aggression, because she trusts the people who've been caring for her. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, officials weighing regulations against obvious reality, community members choosing sides based on their relationship with Tom and their understanding of the situation. The decision could go either way: bureaucratic compliance or common-sense flexibility. Sheriff Martinez finally broke the silence. "Elena, your paperwork is in order for transport?" "Completely legal and properly documented," she confirmed. "Luna will receive expert care at a facility designed for animals in her situation." "Then I see no reason to interfere with legitimate wildlife management," the sheriff decided. "Tom, next time you find yourself in a situation like this, call professionals immediately. You've been lucky this time." Officer Bradley started to protest, but Martinez cut him off with a look that said the decision was final. The crisis had passed, but Tom found himself shaking with delayed reaction to how close they'd come to losing. Everything, the worn leather, collar around Luna's neck, had become more than identification during their weeks together. It represented the complex relationship between freedom and safety, between wild independence and the security that came from accepting care from others. As the crowd of officials and neighbors dispersed, leaving only Tom, Elena, and the transport team, the collar's significance became clear. It marked Luna as a creature caught between worlds, neither fully wild nor completely domesticated, but deserving of life, regardless of where she fit in human categories. Elena approached the trailer's rear door with practiced calm, her movements deliberate and unthreatening. "Luna, sweet girl, it's time to go home," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned trust through consistent care over many years. Tom positioned himself where Luna could see him clearly through the trailer's side window. Their eyes met, pale green studying weathered brown, and he saw acceptance rather than anxiety in her expression. She understood, in whatever way mountain lions comprehend such things, that this transition was necessary and beneficial rather than another abandonment. "You ready for this, girl?" Tom asked softly, and Luna responded with one of her distinctive vocalizations, the low, rumbling sound that had become their form of conversation. Elena opened the transport door, revealing Luna's temporary confinement for what Tom hoped would be the last time. The mountain lion rose smoothly from her resting position, displaying the fluid grace that marked her complete physical recovery. 6 weeks earlier, she'd been unable to lift her head. Now she moved with the confident power of an apex predator in perfect health, but it was Luna's emotional state that amazed Tom most. She showed no signs of the depression and withdrawal that Elena had described from her pre-escape period at the sanctuary. Her ears were alert, her posture engaged, her eyes bright with the curiosity that marked a creature invested in life rather than merely enduring it. Luna paused at the trailer's threshold, looking directly at Tom with an expression that seemed almost human in its intensity. Then she did something that stopped everyone's breathing. She approached the edge of the trailer and extended her massive head toward Tom, close enough that he could have touched her muzzle if he'd reached out. "She's saying goodbye," Elena whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I've never seen her initiate contact like that." Tom raised his hand slowly, giving Luna every opportunity to retreat if his movement felt threatening. Instead, she moved closer, allowing him to rest his palm against the side of her face. Her fur was warm and incredibly soft, carrying the faint scent of desert sage and the antiseptic he'd used to treat her wounds. "Thank you," he said quietly, speaking to Luna, but knowing the words were meant for something larger than either of them. "Thank you for teaching me how to care about something again." Luna held the contact for several heartbeats before stepping back and moving past Elena toward the sanctuary vehicle. Her transition was willing, almost eager, as if she recognized the scents and sounds of her true home. Within minutes, she was secured in the professional transport cage, calm and ready for the journey ahead. "I'd like to accompany her to the sanctuary," Tom said, surprising himself with the decisiveness of the request. "Make sure she settles in properly." Elena's smile showed understanding of needs that went beyond Luna's welfare. "I was hoping you'd say that. The drive will give us time to talk about some possibilities for your continued involvement." The journey to Vasquez Wildlife Sanctuary took 2 hours through high desert, country that reminded Tom of his own land, red rock mesas, juniper-dotted hillsides, and vast skies that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. Luna traveled calmly, occasionally vocalizing in response to Tom's voice from the following vehicle, but showing none of the stress behaviors that marked unwilling captives. The sanctuary itself exceeded Tom's expectations. Professional facilities spread across 40 acres of fenced wilderness, providing large enclosures that mimicked natural habitats while ensuring safety for both animals and caretakers. Luna's designated space was a 2-acre compound with rock formations, native vegetation, and a small pond that reflected the afternoon sky. "This is beautiful," Tom said, watching Luna explore her new environment with obvious interest. "She'll have room to behave naturally." "That's the goal," Elena replied. "We can't give them complete freedom, but we can provide dignity and space for natural behaviors." Luna's reintroduction to sanctuary life proceeded smoothly. She investigated every corner of her enclosure, marked territorial boundaries with scent, and eventually settled on a high rock outcropping that provided views across the surrounding landscape. Her body language showed satisfaction rather than confinement anxiety. "She remembers this place," Elena observed. "Look how she's moving, confident, purposeful. This is home for her." As afternoon faded toward evening, Eleanor broached the subject of Tom's future involvement with the sanctuary. "We're always looking for volunteers with your obvious skills. Luna isn't our only animal with trauma issues. And you seem to have a gift for reaching creatures that have given up on life." The offer represented exactly the kind of purpose Tom had been unconsciously seeking, meaningful work that honored Maria's memory while providing him with ongoing reason to engage with the world. Caring for Luna had reminded him that he possessed valuable skills beyond the practical mechanics of ranch maintenance. "I'd like that," Tom said, watching Luna settle into her evening routine with the grace of an animal that belonged exactly where she was. Maria always said the best way to honor love was to keep giving it away. Eleanor's expression showed understanding of the deeper currents flowing beneath their practical conversation. "Love doesn't end when the object of love changes form," she said. "It just finds new ways to express itself." The drive home took place in gathering darkness, with desert stars beginning to appear in the vast sky above. Tom felt the strange mixture of loss and completion that accompanied major life transitions, sadness at ending his daily care for Luna, but satisfaction at knowing he'd helped restore her to a life worthy of her dignity. The collar she still wore would remain part of her permanent identification, a reminder that some creatures needed human support to thrive, and that providing such support was among humanity's higher callings. Tom had found his way back to that calling through Luna's need, and Luna had found her way back to life through Tom's willingness to risk caring again. Pulling into his ranch driveway, Tom looked toward the barn, where Luna's stall stood empty, but not abandoned. Tomorrow he would clean it thoroughly and prepare it for whatever creature might next need sanctuary on this land that had seen so much love, loss, and healing. Maria would have approved of such preparation, being ready to help when help was needed. Keeping hope alive through practical action, the wooden cross stood beneath the big cottonwood tree where Maria used to read poetry on summer evenings, hand-carved from the same mesquite wood Tom had used for her walking stick. He'd spent 3 weeks crafting it during the quiet winter evenings, each careful cut of the knife a meditation on memory and acceptance. The inscription was simple: Maria Elena Reyes. She taught me that love multiplies when shared. Below that, in smaller letters, every creature deserves a chance. 3 months had passed since Luna's departure, and Tom's life had found a rhythm he couldn't have imagined during his darkest period of grief. Tuesday and Friday mornings found him at Vasquez Wildlife Sanctuary, where he'd become the volunteer coordinator for their animal therapy program. His gift for reaching traumatized creatures had proven as valuable as Elena had predicted. Luna thrived in her sanctuary environment, displaying behaviors that reminded Tom daily why their separation had been necessary. She'd claimed the highest platform in her enclosure as her preferred resting spot, from which she could survey the surrounding landscape with the dignity of a queen holding court. More remarkably, she'd begun showing maternal interest in the sanctuary's younger cats, a jaguar cub rescued from illegal captivity and 2 mountain lion, juveniles whose mothers had been killed by vehicles. She's teaching them hunting behaviors. Elena had explained during Tom's last visit. Watch how she demonstrates the proper crouch, how she shows them where to position their paws. It's like she's found purpose again in nurturing the next generation. Tom's twice-weekly visits to Luna always included poetry readings, a practice that had expanded to include other animals at the sanctuary. He'd discovered that his voice had a calming effect on various species, and Elena had encouraged him to incorporate reading sessions into the facility's enrichment programs. Big cats, bears, and even the resident wolves showed remarkable attention when Tom read from Maria's collection of nature poetry. They respond to the rhythm and emotional content, Elena had explained. Animals are more sensitive to human vocal patterns than most people realize. You're providing them with a form of meditation. The sanctuary work had reconnected Tom with his community in ways he hadn't expected. Dr. Sarah Jen volunteered her veterinary services there monthly and had become a friend rather than just Maria's former oncologist. Jake Morrison had started donating hay for the sanctuary's herbivores and occasionally accompanied Tom on his volunteer days. Even Father Miguel had visited, blessing the memorial garden where the sanctuary honored animals that had died in their care. You found your calling, Sarah told Tom one afternoon as they watched Luna demonstrate stalking techniques for her adopted charges. Maria always said you were meant to heal things. The ranch itself was showing signs of renewed life and care. Tom had repaired the barn thoroughly, upgraded the water system, and even planted a small garden where Maria's had once flourished. Not because he intended to return to full-scale ranching, but because the land deserved attention from someone who understood its potential. He'd begun discussing with Elena the possibility of turning part of his property into a rehabilitation site for animals preparing to return to the sanctuary after medical treatment. The evening ritual of reading. Maria's final letters had evolved into something less painful and more celebratory. Her words no longer felt like messages from the dead, but like ongoing guidance from someone whose love continued to work in the world through his actions. The letter that had become his favorite was her last one, marked, "When you're ready to love again. Tommy," it read, "by the time you find this letter, you'll have discovered that grief and love aren't opposites. They're different faces of the same profound human capacity. Grief is love, with nowhere to go, but love always finds new channels if we let it." She'd known him well enough to predict that his healing would come through caring for other wounded creatures, that his path back to life would involve extending the same patient compassion to others that she'd shown him during her illness. "Don't Don't think you're betraying my memory by loving again," the letter continued. "Love is meant to multiply, not to be hoarded like a finite resource. Every creature you help, every moment of care you provide, every time you choose connection over isolation, that's my love continuing to work in the world through your hands and heart." On this particular evening, as autumn painted the desert in shades of gold and amber, Tom sat beneath the cottonwood tree, reading poetry aloud to an audience of desert wind and gathering stars. It had become his way of including Maria in his new life, sharing with her the verses that brought him comfort and the memories that no longer brought only pain. Luna's latest letter from Elena, she insisted on sending regular updates, described how the mountain lion had begun calling to Tom. Whenever she heard his truck approaching the sanctuary, the big cat would position herself at the front of her enclosure and produce her distinctive vocalizations until Tom appeared for their poetry session. Even separated by necessity, their bond continued to provide mutual comfort and purpose. She remembers you, not as the person who found her dying, but as the one who helped her remember how to live, Elena had written. That's the greatest gift you could have given any creature, the restoration of hope. The sanctuary had become more than volunteer work for Tom. It was his church, his community center, his continuing education in the endless varieties of love and loss that defined existence for all sentient beings. Working with Elena and her staff had reminded him that he possessed valuable skills and insights, that his experience with grief could serve others facing similar challenges. Walking back toward the house as full darkness settled over the ranch, Tom paused at Maria's memorial cross. The mesquite wood had weathered to a silvery gray that seemed to glow in the starlight, and desert wildflowers had begun growing naturally around its base, ghost flower and desert lupine, varieties that Maria had particularly loved. 3 more cubs arrived at the sanctuary this week, he told her, following his practice of sharing important news during these evening visits. Luna's taken them under her wing, just like she did with the others. Elena thinks she's found her true calling as a surrogate mother. The house no longer felt like a shrine to loss, but like a repository of treasured memories that informed rather than imprisoned his daily life. Maria's study remained exactly as she'd left it, but Tom now spent time there reading and planning, rather than simply mourning. Her poetry collection had become a working library, with pages marked for animals who responded to particular verses and new discoveries about the healing power of beautiful words shared with patient listeners. Settling into his chair on the front porch, Tom looked out across the desert landscape that had witnessed so much joy and sorrow, loss and recovery. Luna was 40 miles away, but somehow still present in the careful routines of care and attention that structured his days. Maria was 2 years gone, but somehow still active, in the love that continued to flow through his hands toward creatures in need of healing. The wedding ring on his finger caught starlight as it had every night since Maria's death, but its weight no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it served as a reminder that some bonds transcend physical presence, that love once given continues to work in the world long after its original object has changed form. Tom had learned to carry his grief without letting it carry him, to honor his losses without being defined by them. Tomorrow would bring another day of useful work, another opportunity to help wounded creatures remember their capacity for trust and joy. Tonight offered the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd found his way back to life, not by forgetting the past, but by allowing it to inform a future worthy of all he'd been given and lost and found again.